So it's interesting, the theme of today's conversation is about sort of remaining vital and vibrant in the midst of a changing political landscape, let's say. So being a member of the helping profession myself, I work for Facing History and Ourselves, and so I spend much of my time working directly with teachers and educators and supporting them around supporting their students and their families, right? And I think it's clear to me and my colleagues that the current moment is presenting lots of challenges for schools, challenges for healthcare providers, that the consequences of being immersed in a sense of fear or hypervigilance takes a toll on the body, physically and psychologically, right? And so a lot of us are working harder to meet the needs of our families. But I also think it's important to sort of step back in the particular political moment and reflect on the past. I've been struck by so many conversations like, how did we get here? What's going on in the country, right? And part of me, as a sort of cheeky way once responded, is like, where have you been, right? This has been going on, and many of us who are in the helping professions know that already, right? The issues that we deal with, the vulnerabilities of families are a function of things that have been created, systems and sets of ideas that were created a long time ago. And so that we live downstream from that. And so that the work that we do is always about attending to this. Having said that, the current political climate, it seems like something's different, right? There's increased level of at least vocal violence, right? Lots of reports coming out in recent days saying that there's spikes in discriminatory behavior on campuses, rises in things like anti-Semitism, xenophobia, right? But I do think it's important to understand that we've been here before, and I think that to me is about strategy and about the long term, right? I've been engaged in lots of work around helping or addressing issues of concern and vulnerability. I don't know how I stumbled on it early in my life, but it was clear to me pretty early on that I'm here to try to solve problems, right? Could be here to make money, but I just don't find it all that interesting or compelling. Fortunately, I can make a living doing the work that I do. But what I find, the more I stay immersed in the work, is that actually the work is about connecting people, right? In some cases, about getting them resources that they've been systematically denied, but in many cases, it's connecting people. And some of the very people that I've been asked to support or help actually are amazingly adept at dealing with their situations and circumstances. Sometimes they don't have the resources, but they are adept. They're adaptable, and I think that's a good thing. One of the reasons, though, I do think about the long haul is it gives us opportunities to think about what do we do right now, right? What do we do in the moment? And it's tricky. Information is coming to us at a pace that it never has come to us before in human history, right? Most of us walk around with a device in our pocket that has the computing power that used to reside in, computers that were as large as this room. Now we can carry it around in our pocket in a phone. In some cases, we wear it on our wrist, right? What this means, however, is that information is brought to us at a pace that we're not really set up to comprehend. And if we're paying a lot of attention to it, we find ourselves being run ragged by the information coming in. There's an unrelenting stream of information. And most of it's awful, right? News doesn't sell print, or they don't sell advertisement by sharing wonderful stories about how people overcome and triumph against all odds. I'm not convinced we couldn't do that, but that doesn't seem to be the model right now. That said, that these things can be distracting because what we have to do hasn't changed. It hasn't changed. We have to support the families that we serve. We have to help them access the resources that in many cases they've been systematically denied. And we have to create networks of connectivity. I think there's great power in ecosystems of relationship. And I think that's what these cafes are about. It's about creating networks of relationships, and that gives us resilience, right? It is through each other that we find ourselves, and it's through each other that we're able to move mountains together. And I think that's an important big idea. And so I'm going to actually do some of that work with you today. I mean, I want you to walk out of this room with a little bit more knowledge about each other, and in doing that, hopefully discover some more knowledge about yourself. I had the pleasure of sitting on the San Mateo County Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Commission for about 12 or 13 years. And what I found in that work is that much of what gave us lasting results was connecting people, right? Was connecting people. People who may have known each other, may not have. People who in many cases were working on the same problem, but just different parts of it. So if we imagine it's an elephant, somebody's pulling on the trunk, somebody's got the tail, somebody's got a tusk, somebody's got on the foot. And the reality is we're trying to move the same circumstances, but we're pushing and pulling on this case, the elephant in different ways. And so part of what our work was about getting people in a room together, drawing some relationships, and through creating those relationships, building trust, and through trust, beginning to work together to solve some of the problems and create some of the systems and structures that were so sorely needed. And so a lot of that is about developing relationships. And I think about how challenging that is sometimes, right? We're running quickly. Those of us who live in the Bay Area know we're spending more and more time in our car. And even though we're hyper-connected with our digital devices, sometimes it feels harder and harder to form authentic relationships, right? We become more enamored with how people respond to us than the authenticity of the interactions that we have, right? So what I want to do today is start this process, or continue the process, because I know it's already underway, of putting you in conversation with each other and building these networks of relationships. And so we'll have a couple exchanges, but the first one, what I want to do is give you an opportunity to learn a little bit more about your colleagues. And we're going to do it in a particular way. We're going to use an activity called You Can't Tell by Looking at Me, right? You can't tell by looking at me. And I think it can be a powerful activity, and you'll let me know one way or the other. But I think it's important to look beyond what seems to be apparent and obvious, right? To look beyond what seems to be apparent and obvious. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, that's always the work, is how do we dig deeper? How do we get below the surface? Because in many cases, the history that we come out of causes us to see each other in ways that minimize or diminish the complexity that we all carry. Everybody in this room is more than meets the eye. We're a combination of our certain phenotypic traits, sure. But we're also a combination of our experiences and relationships. Some of those experiences and relationships are tied to who we appear to be, right? And so in some cases, we develop knowledge as a function of having to navigate the interactions that are a function of how we appear to be. But in many cases, they don't get us to where we need to be. And that's to get below the surface, right? Because once we get below the surface, we can connect on an authentic level. I didn't see the movie Titanic, but I suspect most people know it as a useful reference, right? And I'm not talking about Leonardo DiCaprio. I'm actually thinking about the iceberg itself that had that meeting with the Titanic, right? In the sense that icebergs are useful to think about metaphorically, in the sense that we're a lot like icebergs, right? Much of who we are resides below the surface, right? And yet most of our interactions on a daily basis are, at least in part, animated by who we appear to be. And so the idea of, I'm more than meets the eye is about getting below the surface of the water and beginning to sort of examine who we are and what makes us who we are. Now, I also suspect that some of you may not know each other well, but I don't want to assume that. And so as we move into the activity shortly, what I want to do is give everybody an opportunity to sort of enter at their own pace. But I also want to put out a challenge, right? I think that in some cases we withhold information from each other as a way of maintaining positionality, right? But we get different messages about it, right? In some cases, it's actually the revelations about each other that give us those possibilities of connection. And I think as somebody who's been fortunate enough to travel quite a bit, I'm struck by the fact that in almost every society, maybe every society I've ever been in, is that most greetings are some expression of vulnerability, right? Most greetings are some expression of vulnerability. So whether I'm in places like Japan where I bow and expose the crown of my head, or I'm left-handed, or I extend my right hand, which is most people's dominant hand, it's occupied, or whether you lean in for a hug, there are ways of exposing, your vital organs. So all these are in different ways expressions of trust, are expressions of vulnerability. And so the flip side of that coin of vulnerability is actually trust. It is by communicating that I believe that you will treat me fairly that allows us to actually close a space between two individuals. And so with that said, we're going to do this activity you can't tell by looking at me. And it's a series of conversations in the round. It's basically a sentence stem activity. So it starts out fairly simply. You can't tell by looking at me. And then my job is to finish that sentence. So if you're doing it at tables, we would go around and somebody would start, hi, my name is such and such. You can't tell by looking at me, and then finish the sentence. The next person would say that, and you would go around. And what I'm going to suggest is that we go around twice, because something interesting happens as we begin to go around more than once. You don't have to overshare. You only share what you're comfortable in sharing, right? But note that when you do share, and when you do share deeply, it creates a possibility for somebody else to do the same, right? It creates the possibility for somebody else to do the same. So what I want to do is let's do a couple rounds. I want you to sort of jump in at your table. So you start out, hi, my name is such and such. You can't tell by looking at me. And then the next person will go. So what I want to encourage you to do is not to respond to anything that anybody says, but just to sit with what they're sharing, right? Oftentimes in conversation, we lean in and we ask questions of each other. It's actually normal. It's a way of engaging, expressing interest. But sometimes that can come at the expense of somebody actually being able to fully articulate their thought or to share what they want to share, because they get sidetracked by the conversation, which is fine, but sometimes it comes at the expense of that deeper level of knowing. So again, it's going to be, my name is such and such. You can't tell by looking at me that. And so it's literally an opportunity to create a second first impression or a third first impression, so on and so forth. And you can enter the room bringing the aspects of yourself to the table that you would like to, and sometimes aren't allowed to or aren't invited to. So that's the spirit of the sharing. I think it's keeping in concert with the theme. So we'll go around a couple times. At some point, I'll ask us to pause, and we'll reflect a little bit, and then we'll move the conversation forward. Any clarifying questions? Anybody need any more directions? All right, I'll ask you, did you be fully present for each other? Again, it's you can't tell by looking at me that. And let's make sure we go around at least twice at the tables. All right, so let's spend a minute sort of unpacking and doing a little bit of shared meaning making. So how many of you found that activity challenging to you? Maybe just with a show of hands. How many found it kind of a challenge? Yeah, fair enough, right? We live in a society in which we're not often asked to share about ourselves, and sometimes if we share some things, we're concerned about the consequences of that sharing, right? How many of you found that to be a relief or something enjoyable to have that opportunity to share? Great, right? So that also speaks to the fact that we oftentimes don't have the time, or we don't create the time or don't have it, sometimes it's a little bit of both, to actually just slow it down and have an authentic human interaction, right? And it costs us, right? It costs us. It costs us on a personal basis, and it certainly costs us on our ability to make connections with each other. How many of you learned something new or unique about a colleague that you hadn't known? Yeah, right, lots to be gained. I work with educators a lot, and so in many cases, I'll oftentimes ask them, why do you teach? And I'm oftentimes astounded that for people, in many cases who've worked together for years, have never shared their basic motivations about why they do the work, right? And I suspect that most of us in helping professions are in here for a reason as well, right? There's something that draws us to the work, right? There's a reason we show up. Maybe it's connected to our own personal experience, an experience we observe, but it's personal, right? Relevance is personal, right? And so I'd just be curious, what did you notice as you shared? And when I say that, you might notice what was happening in your own body. You might be sort of somatically aware of how you felt in the experience of sharing. Maybe you started with a sense of anxiety and it lessened over time. Maybe you were filled with excitement from the get-go and it just continued to build, right? I don't want to assume that everybody's having the same experience, but I'd love to get a sense of what did you notice? What did you notice? We'll start here and then we'll just work our way around.
Well, right away, here's something interesting and I want to comment on it, so I can conversation.
Yeah. yes, ideas are sticky. When we get knowledge about each other, we want to lean into it, we want to engage more. And yet sometimes that comes at the expense of getting even deeper, right? But that's great. It's a good experience to have. Yeah, how about yourself?
First round, had a lot of sort of nervousness about what to share.
Yeah.
Second round, sort of less jump in and dig, dig deeper, I think. It was interesting what
Yeah. Yeah, and we're watching it, we're hearing it, but we're also watching it. And I think that's really interesting to notice what's happening in our conversation. Oddly enough, even when we're in conversation, much of what's communicated is actually nonverbal, right? Our ability to see and interpret the way in which we're responding, body language, intonation, positioning, all these things give us information. So it's just interesting to notice how we process that. Other ideas that came up?
Just the same sort of thing. The first round was really surface information, and I found that the second round was more personal.
So when we got to the second round, or those of you got to the second round, some of you may have even gone third or fourth rounds. What was the experience of going deeper? How did that shift the energy at the table, for lack of a better word, as you got a little bit more intimate and shared with a little bit more depth? What did you notice? Yeah.
So the second round, I wanted to share something that was pretty personal. So I was like, should I share it? Should I not? And I was like, okay, I will. And then it turns out, I think everybody at the table turned out to have the same exact personal experience, and we didn't know.
Yeah. Isn't that an interesting thing, right? We're taught to see difference, and indeed, there are differences among us, but in many cases, those differences obscure our similarities, right? There's more similarities shared between groups than there is difference, and I think sometimes that's hard to wrap our head around. We have to actually experience it, but it's powerful when it begins to happen, right? I suspect the same may be true between ourselves and the clients that we serve, right? The reality is that I know as an educator, I'm given certain sorts of authority, not all of which I've earned or necessarily should have. And if I'm not clear on that, that may shape my relationship with my students or the teachers I serve, for that matter, in a way that's counterproductive. It might assume that I'm the one who's holding all the knowledge and they're the empty vessel. And I've never been in a room in which we don't know more collectively than any one person does in that room individually, right? And yet we live in a society that has historically been preoccupied with identifying who we are, ranking us, and ordering us. And then as a function of that, allocating opportunities in ways that are systematic. And so when we think about attendance at university, things that may be most important to consider are the zip code that people are born into, rather than some sort of innate hereditary endowment, right? That it's the opportunities that we have or don't have that shape where we oftentimes go in terms of our academic experiences. My work puts me in conversation with lots of academics, and in many cases I seek them out because I'm curious about ideas. But I'm never surprised anymore when I see people that have lots and lots of letters who don't seem to know much about anything beyond the letters, or can't get out of their discipline. And disciplining is important. It is a discipline. It's to shape the way in which you think, but sometimes that may come at the expense of thinking more broadly. I'm also never surprised when I find somebody who doesn't carry any letters, but is absolutely brilliant and carries lots and lots of knowledge. Knowledge that they accrue through life experiences, either navigating or reflecting on their own or observing those or others, right? So we hold knowledge in different ways, and I think part of our work is finding out where those caches of knowledge are, and experience, because experience is a form of knowledge, and then finding ways to leverage those in relationship to the challenges that we're trying to face. For me, I think one of the big shifts happened when I started to really question the narratives that were animating society, right? Narratives of deficits or deficiency that exist in certain populations, right? We could look, there's an ongoing conversation here in Silicon Valley about the absence of women in Silicon Valley, right? And there was that conversation about lean in. If women were just more aggressive, assertive, and leaned into the table, they'd have access to all these opportunities. I'd say women have been leaning in for a long time, and the opportunities don't always come cascading down. Right? Women are still making 78 cents on the dollar on the hour that men are with the same qualifications. So one of two things is happening. Either women aren't just up to the task, or the way that we've assigned value or meaning to women causes us to diminish what they do and to compensate them differently. We could say the same thing about immigrant communities, people of color. We see these persistent patterns, and our tendency to frame the conversations is to root those outcomes within the body, right? There's something they're lacking, right? But the reality is there's no theoretical warrant for that, right? We may be taught that, and so that's why I sometimes sort of question book smarts, because the institutions themselves, in many cases, create otherness. Those of us who sort of track ideas over long periods of time know that there are ideas that come cascading out of the ivory towers that people make deep investments in, only to find out 10 or 15 years later that they're problematic ideas, and that even though they were trying to do their best to create, to provide care, that some of the ideas themselves were harmful, right? Thinking about it in an election, it's interesting sort of reflecting back on some of the ideas about sort of crime and criminality. So most of you probably remember at least some point hearing this idea about super predators, that there's a whole generation of kids who are, children of crack babies who are going to come out and they're going to be these wretched people and they're going to destroy society. Well, oddly enough, none of that has taken place, right? And yet we've incarcerated an entire generation of children, fracturing their communities, in some cases severing structures for cultivating leadership. And then you know that there'll be another emerging narrative that rationalizes the legacies of that and then recreates it again. So we have to be skeptical a little bit about book knowledge. We have to engage with ideas, but we also have to engage with them in critical ways. I know in education there's a lot of conversation about grit. People just worked harder, then they would, they would be in a better situation. I find that interesting, just to say the least, right? What we find, and I'm sure that most of you know this already because you work in communities that operate outside of ecosystems of opportunities and resources, is they got plenty of grit, right? They got lots of resilience, lots of creative ideas for how to respond to what they don't necessarily have. And so why would we, in a society that has a history of allocating resources along very predictable lines, why would we assume those folks who have historically been denied the resources should just work harder? And maybe we should spend our energy trying to reframe the conversation, because the reality is all these ideas that would cause us to see each other through diminished lenses come at the expense of tapping into the resources that we have inherently across all communities. Intellect is equally distributed across all human populations. That's a fact, right? The question then becomes, how do we create the structures so that the opportunities and the resources get to everybody? And in some cases may mean that those communities that are historically underserved need more resources, right? But any of you who know the way the budgets work, that oftentimes when the budgets get tight, some of the cuts hit those with most needs hardest, and they hit them first. Right, and that's some of the stuff that we're dealing with now. And I know it's heartbreaking, right? Because in many cases, the systems and structures we put together have demonstrated themselves to be generative and successful. And so then when the budget rounds come and the hits come and they cause us to gut programs. I remember when we lost the girls' camp up on the hill, right? We put together some really amazing programs. I thought the county was very prescient in thinking about the specific needs of young women, many of them who were survivors of sexual trauma, other kinds of victimization, that their experience of incarceration was different, and many of the conditions that put them in the situation to make the choices or have choices made for them that led to their incarceration, that if you didn't attend with the root causes, you weren't actually going to resolve the behaviors, right? But I know when funds got tight, those were some of the first things that were resolved, right? That the program was shut down, and my recollection has been revised, probably not to the same state that it was, but it's a move in the right direction to get those situations back in place, right? So that's the dance that we have to do. So what I'd love to do now is actually give you another opportunity to tap into each other as resources and reservoirs of knowledge. And I think I'd like to do this with a little bit of maybe a writing or reflective activity first. So if you don't have a writing utensil, don't worry, it's not a crisis. You can do the thought in your head. People could think before they had pens. They could certainly think before they had computers. So I think we can go back to the Wayback Machine. We'll be just fine. But what I'd love for you to do is spend a few moments thinking about Actually, let me give you the process first. And so the way we'll do it is, again, it's sort of a structured speaking and listening activity. So there's no real need to number off at the table, but decide who's going to go first. And when you do the sharing, I just want you to move in sort of a clockwise or counterclockwise fashion. I don't need to impose that much control on you. But I want you just to take opportunities to give everybody the chance to share before you move into conversation. And so it's not a dissertation length sharing, but enough to sort of surface some of the main nuggets or ideas. But here's what I'd like for you to spend. Let's take about 2 minutes or so just to do the reflection of the writing before we move into conversation. So going back to this idea that we're all resources, right? We're resources to ourselves and we're resources to others. It makes me think of, anybody heard of Youth Speaks? Yeah, they do some amazing, amazing work, spoken word work, and with these amazing young poets. But I think they stumbled onto something really, just a beautiful, clean idea. They talk about this idea of life as primary text. And so often as students, you're asked to write about something, and oftentimes what you're asked to write about has nothing to do with you. But they said, in terms of giving voice to young folks, we want to use their life as primary text. And so it's out of examining and reflecting on their life that they draw up the materials that they then will render into poems, powerful poems. So I'd like to have that exchange in this similar sort of vein. So I'd like to think about your own storehouse of knowledge, right? The things you bring to the table, to the work that you do. So maybe that knowledge was informed by your personal experience, right? Maybe it's something that you lived through or observed as a child or a young adult that informs the way you understand a certain issue, right? Perhaps it was a function of working with your clients, right? Oftentimes it's through working with our clients that we discover things about the work that helps us become more effective in the work. And then lastly, we'll go to more academic ideas. Maybe it was a book, maybe it was a lecture, maybe it's something else that gave you an important pearl of information or knowledge that allows you to do your work more effectively. But we all bring something to the table. And so what I would love, what I'm hoping will happen is that as we think about how we approach our work, it may be useful to share what you do specifically with your colleagues. But I'd love for you to share something that you've learned about resilience, right? About resilience or fortitude or creative responses, because I think in many ways they're similar, right? Our resilience comes from creating creative responses to untenable situations, right? So I'd love to, let's take about 2 minutes. I've turned my phone off, so I'll just sort of watch the clock there. Let's take 2 minutes of silent reflection and give you an opportunity to conjure up that experience. And then once that time is up, I'm going to ask somebody to identify themselves as the person to start that conversation. Then we're just going to go around the table and share those ideas. Sound fair enough? Okay, so let's just take this couple minutes. All right, so if you didn't do so already, go ahead and thank your partners. Yeah, right. Yeah, so, you're welcome. So I wanted to make sure I didn't step on anybody's conversation, and I hope I didn't cut anybody short, but I know we're going to be in the room together for another at least 20 some odd minutes, so if you didn't get a chance to finish your story, I encourage you to follow up with your colleagues. So hopefully you walk away from this morning sort of thinking, knowing a little bit more about some of your colleagues, for sure, and sort of thinking about the power of sharing ideas, sharing experiences, and how that process of sharing enriches us all. We all walk away with a deeper level of knowledge when we can filter ideas and experiences and share them with each other. So I'd be curious, just in terms of sharing, how many of you tapped into your own personal knowledge, your own sets of experiences that were useful in helping you? Great. How many of you were able to leverage the experience maybe of a client or somebody you've supported or maybe supported you? Great. And then how many of you tapped into sort of, book knowledge or academic knowledge? Great, right? So ideas are everywhere. They're literally everywhere, right? So that's, how many walked away with something that you'd like to try or an affirmation of something that you're already doing? Right? All right, okay, right. Not all acquisition of knowledge is linear, right? Somebody who's been in education for a long time but didn't necessarily always enjoy it myself, or succeed in traditional ways, I tend to think about knowledge very differently than many of my teachers did. Let's just say that. Knowledge is something that we all have, but it's also something we can all have more of. Intellect is not fixed, and neither is ascribed along lines of gender, class, or race. But those are the sets of ideas that animate the systems that many of us work in, right? And that some ideas are powerful and they can have legacies that are enduring, that can get in the way or interrupt us from doing the kind of work that we want to or need to do. So it's important just to share knowledge, because in some cases it's actually through that process that we are able to more thoroughly interrogate how we come to know what we don't know, how we come to know what we know, but also why we don't come to know certain things, right? And in some cases, the things that we are deprived of may be more important than the things that we're offered. And I don't know why this is sort of a weird segue, because it doesn't take us in a particularly positive way, but I think it does in some respects. So part of the challenges we're facing is because democracy works, right? Is that democracy does in fact work. And that through the progress of folks who historically have been outside of the system, give them opportunities to participate in a more meaningful way, that is threatening to historical practices of power and where power resides. But the fact of the matter is that we're moving anyways, right? Demographic shift is a glacial force, and it's real. And had it not been for many of the ideas we invested in and how that informed things like immigration laws and a variety of other things, we would have made these shifts a long time ago. And so they're slow in coming, but it's coming all the way. And I do think that democracy is on the side of demography, meaning that as we become more diverse as a society, that democracy will benefit from that. Because again, we all bring different things, different kinds of knowledge to the table. And then making this experiment in democracy work is all of our work, right? But part of it means coming to the table with our best selves and excavating the past so that we don't fall into those pitfalls. I'll share just a little bit of a story because it sort of came up in my exchanges with Sudi and Karen when I was preparing for this, and that earlier this week, I guess it was Tuesday, I did a webinar with some folks around a film titled The State of Eugenics. And so it was great. It was a good exchange. It was with Alexandra Minna-Stern, who's the author of Eugenic Nation, and Don Sinclair Shapiro, who was the director of that film. And so the film is about North Carolina's efforts to reckon with its past and its history of sterilization. So what a lot of folks don't know, I study race, and that's led me to a deeper study of eugenics, the scientific reification of race. And what most people don't know is this country invested in those ideas and invested deeply, but has also been very effective at obscuring and covering over those ideas. But as these confrontations are beginning to happen, we begin to understand our past in a different way. So North Carolina, starting back in 2002, began to reckon with its history of sterilization, and is now in the process of joining one other state and compensating the surviving victims of its sterilization programs. Now, what's interesting, and because I'm around this history and certainly agitating to surface it, is that California is likely to be next in this confrontation. California has the dubious distinction of sterilizing more people than any other state in the nation. We sterilize over 20,000 people. And we sterilize them based on assumptions about their relative fitness and worthiness of contributing their gametes to the national population. So the majority of the sterilizations in California happened between 1919 and 1953, but there are certainly sterilizations that have occurred afterwards. I don't know if anybody's seen the film No Mas Bebes, but I would encourage you to check it out. It's about the Madrigal versus Quilligan case in which USC Medical Hospital summarily sterilized Latinas coming in to give birth to their children during the 60s and 70s. The Center for Investigative Reporting broke a story, I want to say it was last June. They knew about it before, but they broke the story last June about sterilizations that have taken place in California prisons in recent years, right? So we oftentimes think these things are relegated to the past, but they're actually a lot more present. And one of the reasons they stay present, one of the reasons these things bubble back up is because we haven't really confronted the past in a way that gives us the ability to understand it for what it is. and to attend to it in the way that we need to. So all this to suggest is that this agitation, this calling out, this reckoning is healthy. It's healthy for democracy. I know it makes some folks uncomfortable, but that's the nature of progress, right? If we were always comfortable, we would never be making any progress, right? We have to be willing to endure a little bit of discomfort and some dissonance in order to begin to imagine beyond the current moment and create the kind of society that we can all be proud to live in. And then values each and everybody so that we actually reap the benefits of who we become and who we will continue to become. So all this to say is we're still here, right? People are still here and people are still getting the work done, right? In spite of lots of efforts to limit people's ability to get to into this country, to limit people's opportunities by segregating or isolating them, limiting the resources they have access to, right? Suggesting that some communities deserve to deal with more of society's pollutants than others, right? So we still have to excise our demons, but that's the work of democracy. And as we do that, we will reveal the strengths and the capacity that we have. And the fact that we're still here as a society and that we're having a moment, but that's a good thing, because if we weren't having the moment, we would continue to be plodding forward, but sometimes doing so with blinders on. So the blinders are off, but for those of us who know, and for those of us in the work, we know that it's about showing up every day. It's about being in space together, listening deeply to each other, and then imagining on beyond the present into the world that we're trying to create. And so I want to thank everybody for being here today and for the work that you do on a daily basis to make society a better place and a healthier place for families and children. So with that, I'm going to sign off and give you the next 20 minutes to mill around and be in conversation with each other. But thanks for a great morning and have a great weekend.